Courtroom silence. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the city courthouse, its light cutting across the polished wooden floors and landing on the face of a quiet man seated alone at the front row. Sundar Pichai, dressed simply, in a modest gray suit, sat with his hands folded, his expression calm but unreadable. Around him, whispers filled the room, voices curious, amused, and even dismissive. He wasn't a lawyer, nor did he seem like someone who belonged in a courtroom. Yet today, he had chosen to stand alone before the judge, facing a case that could determine the future of everything he had worked for. People had heard stories, how the tech giant Sundar Pichai was once a poor boy from India, how he rose from a simple home to lead one of the world's biggest companies. But today, they saw none of that glory. His face showed quiet fatigue, the kind that came not from sleepless nights but from disappointment, from realizing how quickly people forgot humility when power blinded them. The opposing lawyer, Mr. Reynolds, was already pacing confidently near the bench. His sharp suit and louder than necessary voice filled the air. "Your Honor," he said with a smirk, "I don't see why this proceeding needs to continue. My client has followed every rule. If Mr. Pichai insists he was wronged, he should have hired a real lawyer, not show up pretending to argue like one." Laughter rippled through the courtroom. Even the judge, an older man with tired eyes and a thin smile, seemed amused, but Sundar didn't flinch. He rose slowly, adjusting his glasses. "Your Honor," he said softly, his voice calm, steady, but filled with quiet authority. "I understand the court's rules, and I understand that I stand here without counsel, but all I ask is that I be heard, not as a CO, not as a public figure, but as a citizen seeking fairness." The judge leaned back in his chair. "Mr. Pichai," he said, almost condescendingly, "you realize this is not a tech conference. You're standing in a courtroom. Do you have any idea how complex the law is?" Sundar smiled gently. "I understand it well enough to know that justice isn't about who speaks the loudest." That line silenced the laughter. For a brief second, the room grew still. The judge's smirk faded slightly, but he waved his hand. "Fine, let's hear it. Surprise us, Mr. Pichai." Sundar walked toward the table, opened a slim black folder, and laid out a few printed pages. "These," he began, "are contracts Your Honor already has on record. They were signed between my company and the software vendor who now claims we violated their intellectual property. They argue we stole their code. What they fail to mention," he said, as his eyes met the opposing counsel's, "is that they built their entire software from an open-source foundation, public code, free for use. All they did was rename it, and now they call it theft when innovation moves faster than they can." The judge raised an eyebrow. "That's a serious claim. Can you prove it?" Sundar nodded slowly. "Yes, not only can I prove it, I can demonstrate it." He turned to the court clerk and handed over a flash drive. Within minutes, a projector displayed side-by-side code comparisons on a large screen. Line after line of code glowed under the dim light of the courtroom. Identical structures, identical errors, identical timestamps. Murmurs began to rise from the crowd. Mr. Reynolds tried to interrupt. "Your Honor, this is absurd. He's not an expert witness." But the judge motioned for silence. His eyes were fixed on the screen now. "Continue," he said quietly. Sundar's tone remained respectful, never boastful. "I've spent my life believing that knowledge should empower, not enslave. Open source projects are the heart of innovation. What my company did was build upon that, improve it, and share it back. And yet here we are, accused by those who profited off free knowledge, now demanding payment for something that was never theirs." There was no arrogance in his voice, only quiet conviction, the kind that came from truth. The judge leaned forward. "So you're saying they built a case on something they don't own?" Sundar nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. And to make it worse, they modified just a few lines of code and filed it under their own trademark, months after we had published our improvements publicly." The room buzzed again. Even Mr. Reynolds' confident smirk began to fade. He glanced nervously at his client, who now avoided his eyes. But the judge wasn't done. "Mr. Pichai," he said, "how did you get access to this information? Sundar turned to him with the same quiet expression. Transparency, Your Honor. It's all publicly available. But most people never bother to read. They prefer to assume guilt when they see someone successful stand alone. The judge leaned back, tapping his pen against the desk. The amusement in his tone was gone. Interesting. Very interesting. Sundar took a breath and looked around the courtroom, at the reporters, the murmuring spectators, and the rows of people who had laughed moments earlier. We live in a world, he said softly, where people are quick to judge what they don't understand, where power and perception often speak louder than truth. I don't stand here to win an argument. I stand here because silence would mean allowing injustice to become the new normal. His words lingered in the air long after he stopped speaking. Even the judge seemed thoughtful, tapping his fingers slowly as he reviewed the papers in front of him. Finally, he said, Mr. Reynolds, do you have anything to say to this? The lawyer cleared his throat. Well, Your Honor, I'll need time to review this evidence. The judge nodded slowly. You'll have that. Court will reconvene tomorrow morning. As the gavel struck, the room began to disperse. Sundar gathered his papers quietly, ignoring the stares. But before he could leave, the judge spoke again. Mr. Pichai, he said, you may not be a lawyer, but I'll admit, you certainly argued like one. Sundar turned slightly, a faint smile crossing his face. I wasn't trying to argue, Your Honor. I was trying to remind everyone that truth doesn't need a title. And with that, he walked out of the courtroom. Outside, the air was cool and heavy with the scent of rain. Sundar looked up at the sky, gray clouds rolling over the city, and took a deep breath. He had faced rooms filled with cynics before, but today felt different. This wasn't about business. It was about dignity, about standing for something even when the world mocked you for it. As he stepped into the waiting car, his assistant handed him a phone. Sir, reporters are asking for a statement. Sundar shook his head gently. No statements, not yet. Let them think whatever they want. Truth doesn't rush. The car pulled away, leaving behind the courthouse and the noise that still lingered there. Inside, Sundar sat in silence, staring out the window at the city he had once arrived in, with nothing but hope. He thought of his father, a man who had taught him that the measure of intelligence wasn't how much you knew, but how calmly you stood when others doubted you. And for the first time that day, Sundar smiled, but deep down, he knew this was only the beginning. Tomorrow, new evidence would surface. Evidence that could change not just the case, but expose a chain of corruption reaching far beyond what anyone in that courtroom could imagine. And as the rain began to fall softly against the glass, Sundar whispered to himself, tomorrow will test more than truth. It will test who's brave enough to stand for it. The unseen hand. The next morning, the courthouse was quieter than usual, but an unusual tension hung in the air. Reporters were already outside, murmuring into their microphones, predicting how the case would swing. Some said Sundar Pichai would lose because he wasn't a trained lawyer. Others said his calm speech yesterday had already begun to turn public opinion, but none of them truly understood what was at stake. To them, it was just another courtroom story. To Sundar, it was a test of integrity, a reminder that truth, when challenged, must not retreat. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere shifted when Sundar walked in. Gone were the whispers of mockery. People's eyes followed him, curious, uncertain. He took his seat with quiet composure, the same faint smile on his face. He carried a single folder again. No briefcase, no entourage. Just him and the truth he intended to prove. The judge entered, his robe flowing behind him, his expression thoughtful. Court is now in session, he said. Mr. Pichai, Mr. Reynolds, let's proceed. Mr. Reynolds rose first, his tone slightly more cautious this time. Your Honor, we reviewed the evidence Mr. Pichai presented yesterday. While we acknowledge certain similarities between the code structures, that doesn't prove theft didn't occur. After all, innovation can't excuse the use of proprietary material. The judge nodded. And do you have new evidence to support that claim? Yes, Your Honor, Reynolds said, motioning to a man sitting at the witness stand. We have brought in Mr. Jonas Green, one of the senior engineers from the plaintiff company, to testify that his team, created the core software long before Mr. Pichai's company made their improvements. Sundar sat quietly, his eyes studying the witness without judgment. Mr. Green looked nervous, but he cleared his throat and began speaking. Yes, Your Honor, my team worked day and night for years. We poured our souls into creating this code. When we released it, we saw similar versions appear under Mr. Pichai's company shortly after. It was devastating. The judge nodded thoughtfully. I see. Mr. Pichai, do you wish to cross-examine? Sundar stood slowly. He walked to the stand, his tone as calm as ever. Mr. Green, he began softly. You said your team worked on this code for years. May I ask, when exactly did you first upload it to the open source repository? Mr. Green blinked, unsure where this was going. About 2 years ago. And when did your company register its trademark? Around 1.5 years ago. Interesting, Sundar said, glancing at the papers in his hand. And would you say your version was entirely your own creation? Of course, Mr. Green replied defensively. Every line. Sundar smiled gently, holding up 2 pages. Then you'll help me understand something. These are 2 code fragments. One from your public release, one from an open source project dated 5 years before your version. The variable names, the structure, even the comment tags are the same. How would you explain that? Murmurs filled the courtroom again. The judge leaned forward. Mr. Green, can you explain? The engineer hesitated. Well, sometimes developers use common references, including using the same spelling mistakes. Sundar interrupted softly. There's a function in your code named getStateData, with state instead of state. That same misspelling exists in the public codebase from 5 years ago. Would you call that coincidence? The silence that followed was suffocating. Even the judge seemed stunned. Sundar's tone was never cruel, never triumphant. It was simply factual, like a teacher guiding a lost student toward truth. Mr. Green's hands trembled slightly. I don't know. Sundar turned toward the judge. Your Honor, I don't wish to embarrass anyone, but the truth must be said plainly. This company built its empire on borrowed foundations, then claimed ownership to crush those who tried to build something better. If the law cannot protect innovation, then fear will replace creativity. The judge took a deep breath, his expression now far more serious than yesterday. Mr. Pichai, I must admit, your understanding of this case goes deeper than most professionals I've seen. But before Sundar could respond, Mr. Reynolds suddenly stood, his tone sharp. Your Honor, this is becoming emotional theater. My client isn't the villain here. Mr. Pichai's company has enough power to manipulate public opinion. We simply want fairness. Fairness, Sundar repeated quietly, turning to face him. Yes, fairness. But fairness is not when the powerful can buy the truth and the humble must beg to be heard. Fairness is when the facts speak louder than titles. For a long moment, the courtroom was still. The judge's eyes lingered on Sundar, as if seeing him differently now. We'll recess for 15 minutes, he finally said, striking the gavel. I need time to review these documents. As people stood and stretched, Sundar walked out quietly, heading toward the small courtyard behind the courthouse. He sat on a bench under a tree, his hands clasped together, thinking. The soft breeze rustled the leaves, but his mind was elsewhere. Back in India, in his childhood home, where his father had once told him, "Truth has no lawyer, son. It has patience." He smiled faintly at the memory. Even then, he had learned that silence, when guided by conviction, was more powerful than shouting. He had seen his father defend neighbors who couldn't afford legal help, using nothing but honesty and courage. Sundar carried that same spirit now, even in a courtroom thousands of miles away. Just then his assistant approached. Sir, someone left this envelope at the front desk for you. No name on it. Sundar opened it slowly. Inside was a single printed email, dated months before the case had even begun. It was a correspondence between the plaintiff company's CEO and a government official, discussing how to pressure certain tech leaders to settle quietly to avoid media attention. His heart tightened as he read it. This wasn't just about a misunderstanding in code. It was about power, silent threats, money, and influence hiding behind polished smiles. He folded the paper carefully, slipping it into his folder. Thank you, he said softly. The 15 minutes passed, and as he returned to the courtroom, something in his eyes had changed. The calm was still there, but beneath it a quiet fire now burned. He wasn't just defending innovation anymore. He was standing against a system that believed it could mock justice and walk away untouched. The judge returned and addressed the room. Mr. Pichai, Mr. Reynolds, will continue. But before that, I have a question. His tone was sharper now, more deliberate. This email, he held up the same printout Sundar had received, was anonymously delivered to my office this morning. I assume you've seen it too. The entire courtroom froze. Mr. Reynolds went pale. Your Honor, that document is not verified. It will be, the judge interrupted. And if it's real, it shows a serious attempt to manipulate this trial. The murmurs rose again. Reporters scribbled furiously. Sundar stood silently, watching the chaos unfold around him. He didn't smile, didn't gloat. He simply whispered, "Truth never hides forever." The judge turned to him. "Mr. Pichai, I'll adjourn the session for the day. Tomorrow we'll call for an independent review. But let me say this. Yesterday I thought you were out of your depth. Today I see you might just be teaching us something about courage." As the gavel fell, Sundar gathered his things once more. Outside the cameras flashed, but he didn't stop. His mind was already on tomorrow, on what this new discovery could reveal, because now it was no longer just a case about stolen code. It was about exposing the unseen hand pulling the strings behind the curtain, and Sundar knew that once he pulled that thread, everything would begin to unravel, including people far more powerful than anyone dared to imagine. The storm behind the glass the next day dawned heavy with mist. Clouds hung low over the courthouse dome, painting the city in shades of gray as if nature itself understood the weight of what was coming. Sundar Pichai arrived early, walking past the waiting reporters without saying a word. Flashes went off, microphones were raised, questions thrown his way, but he only nodded politely and kept walking. There was a strange calm about him, the kind that came not from confidence but from conviction. He knew the storm was about to break and he was ready to stand in the center of it. Inside, the courtroom was filled to capacity. Word of the mysterious email had spread overnight, and now the air buzzed with curiosity and unease. Government officials, journalists, and industry figures had all shown up, pretending to be mere observers. But Sundar could sense their nervous energy. Something about this case had shaken the balance of power, and everyone wanted to see how far it would go. The judge entered with a stern expression. Gone was the mild amusement from the first day. Now he looked like a man carrying the burden of something larger than a simple lawsuit. "Court is now in session," he said, his voice echoing across the hall. "Today, before we proceed, I wish to address the document that was submitted yesterday, the email exchange between Mr. Reynolds' client and an unnamed official." He turned to the prosecutor's side. "Mr. Reynolds, has your client confirmed the authenticity of this document?" Reynolds stood stiffly, his confidence cracked. "Your Honor, we are still investigating its origin. It may have been fabricated to discredit my client." Sundar rose from his seat slowly. "Your Honor, if I may, I have received confirmation from a cybersecurity analyst who verified the metadata. The email headers match the plaintiff company's internal domain, and the timestamps align perfectly with the company's communication logs. This document is genuine." A collective murmur ran through the audience. The judge nodded gravely. "That's very serious, Mr. Pichai. If this is true, it implies deliberate interference in judicial proceedings." Sundar's eyes didn't waver. "It's not just interference, Your Honor. It's a symptom of something deeper, a network of influence built to silence accountability." The judge leaned forward. "And do you have proof of that claim?" Sundar opened his folder and placed a printed report on the bench. "I do. Over the past week, my team traced several unusual financial transfers from shell companies connected to the plaintiff. Those payments were directed to consulting firms owned by individuals who happen to serve on the same advisory board as the official mentioned in that email. This pattern doesn't prove guilt by itself, but it shows intent. The silence that followed was different this time. It wasn't curiosity or amusement, and it was tension, the kind that stretched across the room like a drawn wire. Even Mr. Reynolds' client seated behind him looked pale, his hands trembling slightly. The judge took a deep breath. This case began as a copyright dispute. Now it may involve corruption and obstruction. I'll be forwarding this to the Ethics Commission. As the judge spoke, Sundar felt the weight of the moment settle on him. He hadn't planned to uncover all this. His only goal was to defend fairness, to show that truth could stand against wealth and deceit. But life had a way of revealing what was hidden when you dared to question what others avoided. During the break, Sundar stepped outside for air. The courtyard was quiet, But as he walked under the same tree from the day before, he noticed an old man sitting on the bench beside it. His clothes were worn, his hands rough, but his eyes, they were sharp, observant. The man looked up and said softly, "They didn't expect you to fight this far." Sundar paused. "You know about the case?" The man smiled faintly. "Everyone who still believes in honesty knows about it. You're shaking a tree that's been growing in the dark for too long." "And you?" Sundar asked. "Who are you?" "A retired clerk," the man said. "I worked here for 30 years. I've seen people like them before. Powerful men who think truth is a game. But once in a while, someone comes who reminds the world that justice still breathes." Sundar looked at him thoughtfully. "And what happens to that someone?" The old man chuckled quietly. "He either changes the system, or the system tries to change him." Those words lingered in Sundar's mind as he returned to the courtroom. When he entered, the atmosphere had shifted again. Mr. Reynolds was standing at the judge's bench arguing in a low but urgent voice. "Your Honor, this entire case is being hijacked by media speculation. Mr. Pichai is manipulating public sentiment with theatrics." The judge raised his hand. "Enough. Mr. Reynolds, I'll remind you that your client's actions are under investigation. Until then, this court will proceed strictly on evidence." The opposing lawyer's face reddened. Sundar quietly took his seat, never once raising his voice. When it was his turn to speak, Sundar began not with anger but with reflection. "Your Honor," he said, "we live in an age where data is everywhere but truth is rare. I've seen people hide behind walls of complexity, hoping no one would have the patience to look deeper. That's what corruption thrives on, exhaustion. People stop asking questions because they think it won't matter." He looked around the courtroom. "But it does matter. Every small act of honesty matters. Every person who refuses to give up matters. And this courtroom, more than any place, should be where truth doesn't depend on power." His voice grew softer, but the silence that followed made every word feel louder. Even the judge seemed moved. "Mr. Pichai," he said slowly, "do you realize your words today will be remembered?" Sundar smiled faintly. "I don't need them to be remembered, Your Honor. I just need them to be understood." As the judge nodded, a sudden commotion broke out near the courtroom door. A messenger rushed in, handing a sealed document to the clerk, who whispered something to the judge. The judge's brow furrowed as he read the note. Then he looked up, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Pichai," he said carefully, "I've just received notice that your company's legal team has been subpoenaed in a separate investigation. Apparently, new evidence suggests that what you uncovered here links to a broader corporate cover-up involving multiple firms, not just the plaintiff." Sundar's expression didn't change, but inside he felt the ground shift beneath him. This was bigger than he thought. Much bigger. And though he hadn't intended to, he had just stepped into a web that stretched across industries and borders. The judge stood. "Court will adjourn for now. Tomorrow we will hear new testimonies and review the connected case files. I advise everyone here, tread carefully. The truth is coming out, and it seems it will not stop with this courtroom." As the gavel struck, Sundar looked out through the glass window behind the judge. Outside, the rain had begun again, tapping softly against the glass panes like faint whispers of destiny. People were leaving their seats, murmuring, anxious. Yet amid all that noise, Sundar sat still, his gaze distant. He remembered something his mother used to tell him, that storms were never punishments. They were awakenings. And now, watching the raindrops race down the glass, he realized this storm was far from over. It was only just beginning. The breaking point, the courthouse was quieter that morning, but the silence carried a strange heaviness, the kind that comes before something important breaks. Sundar Pichai walked through the marble corridor with his usual calm, but inside he could feel the shift. This was no longer a battle about code or contracts. This was about truth versus the machinery built to bury it. Even the guards at the door watched him differently now. Not as a tech executive, but as a man who had dared to stand alone against power. When he entered the courtroom, there was already a crowd waiting. Cameras, journalists, and curious faces filled every bench. But amid all the noise, Sundar's focus was steady. The judge took a seat and the room fell into order. "We resume proceedings in the case of Pichai versus Global Data Systems," he announced. "Today we will hear testimony from witnesses brought forward after yesterday's revelations." Mr. Reynolds looked exhausted. His usual arrogance had vanished, replaced by a quiet desperation. Beside him, his client, the CEO of the plaintiff company, sat with a pale face, his jaw clenched tight. The email leak had shaken them deeply, and though they denied everything, the damage was visible. The first witness was a young programmer named Lena Thompson. She worked for the plaintiff company, but had resigned a month earlier. Her hands trembled as she took the oath. Sundar watched her kindly, offering a small nod of encouragement. "Miss Thompson," the judge said, "you've come forward voluntarily. What would you like to tell the court?" She hesitated, then spoke in a soft voice. "I joined the company 2 years ago. I thought I was part of something innovative, but soon I realized we were copying open source code and branding it as our own. When I asked questions, I was told to stay quiet. The manager said, 'Everyone does it, so why make noise?' But it wasn't just about code. It was about payments, bribes to keep certain officials silent." The courtroom gasped. Mr. Reynolds immediately objected, shouting, "Your Honor, these are unverified accusations." The judge raised his hand. "Sit down, Mr. Reynolds. We'll let the witness finish." Lena looked directly at Sundar now. "1 week before I resigned, I saw an internal message. An instruction to delete old repositories and replace their timestamps, so it would look like we developed the code earlier. I made a copy of that message before it was erased. I sent it to Mr. Pichai's team yesterday morning." The audience fell silent again. Sundar slowly stood up. "Thank you, Lena. You did the right thing," he said softly. There was no victory in his tone, only quiet respect. The judge called for a brief recess, but no one moved. Everyone could feel it. The balance had shifted completely. Sundar walked to the window. His reflection caught in the glass. For a moment he thought of how strange life was. How a child who once shared one radio with his whole neighborhood now stood in a courtroom defending not wealth, but principle. When the session resumed, the judge turned to the opposing side. "Mr. Reynolds, do you or your client have any defense against these new testimonies?" Reynolds hesitated, glancing at the CEO beside him. "Your Honor, my client wishes to speak privately with the court before continuing." The judge frowned. "You'll speak here in front of everyone." The CEO stood slowly. He was visibly sweating now, his voice low. "Your Honor, I admit some mistakes were made, but we were under pressure. Everyone in this industry bends the rules. We didn't mean for it to go this far." Sundar's calm gaze met his. "Mistakes," he repeated quietly, "are when you forget a detail. This was a choice." The CEO didn't respond. He simply sat down, his shoulders heavy with the weight of defeat. The courtroom was silent for a long time before the judge spoke again. "Mr. Pichai, your arguments and evidence have revealed serious ethical violations, but this court must proceed with care. Justice cannot rush even when truth is clear. An independent investigation will begin immediately." Sundar nodded. "I understand, Your Honor. Justice should never hurry. It should only move forward." As the gavel struck, the case was temporarily adjourned. But the story didn't end there. Outside the courthouse, hundreds of people were waiting. Some applauded, others shouted questions, but Sundar didn't stop for interviews. He walked through the crowd quietly, his thoughts elsewhere. That evening, back in his office, he sat alone by the window overlooking the city lights. The world outside looked peaceful, unaware of the waves this case was already creating. His phone buzzed with messages from allies, reporters, and lawyers offering help. But what caught his attention was a single text from an unknown number. "You've exposed too much. This won't end in court." He stared at the message for a long time. Then he smiled faintly, not because he wasn't afraid, but because he had expected it. Truth once revealed always makes enemies before it makes change. He closed his eyes for a moment, remembering his father's words. That courage is not about winning fights. It's about refusing to stay silent when silence feels safer. He turned off the phone and whispered to himself, "Let them try." The next morning, the headlines were everywhere. Corporate giant exposed for code fraud. Sundar Pichai's evidence triggers government probe. Judge orders full ethics review. The world was watching now, and the pressure on the corrupt network grew heavier. Yet behind the glory, Sundar felt no triumph. He only felt the weight of responsibility, the kind that doesn't fade even after justice is served. Later that day, as he prepared for the final hearing scheduled for tomorrow, his assistant entered nervously. "Sir, someone dropped this at reception." No name, just a note. Sundar opened the envelope slowly. Inside was a photograph, a grainy image of him walking into the courthouse taken from across the street. On the back was a single handwritten line, "Truth has a price." He held the photo in silence, his mind calm but alert. He knew what it meant. Someone was trying to intimidate him, to make him question whether standing up was worth it. But deep inside he knew he wouldn't stop. Fear was temporary. Conscience was eternal. As night fell, he stood by the window again, looking out at the rain-slick streets. The city lights shimmered like reflections of every soul that ever dared to speak the truth and paid for it. He whispered quietly, almost to the night itself. You can threaten the man, but not the truth. And somewhere deep inside, he felt it. The stillness before one final storm. Tomorrow, when he walked into that courtroom again, everything would come to light. The laughter, the arrogance, the manipulation. It would all collapse under the weight of what was real. The truth unchained. The morning light filtered through gray clouds as if the sky itself hesitated to shine too brightly on what was about to unfold. The courthouse stood silent, surrounded by people who whispered in low tones, waiting for something. They knew was no longer just about business or law. It was about conscience. Sundar Pichai stepped out of his car, holding the same worn folder he had carried from the beginning. There was no security entourage, no show of strength. He believed that truth didn't need guards, only courage. As he walked past the reporters, questions rained on him from every side. Mr. Pichai, do you fear retaliation? Will you press criminal charges? Who sent you that threat? He didn't answer any of them. He simply smiled and said, The truth doesn't belong to me. It belongs to everyone. That one line echoed in the air long after he had entered the courthouse. Inside, the room was tense. Mr. Reynolds sat with his head low, no longer the confident man who mocked Sundar days ago. His client, the CEO, looked hollow, the proud facade shattered. The judge entered, his face grave but calm. Court is in session, he said. Today we will review the findings of the independent audit and determine the final course of justice. A hush fell over the courtroom. The judge adjusted his glasses and opened a thick report. According to the investigation, multiple executives at Global Data Systems engaged in falsifying development records, manipulating timestamps, and transferring funds to secure favorable decisions from officials. These findings confirm Mr. Pichai's earlier claims. The audience broke into whispers. Reporters scribbled furiously and cameras clicked like rain. Sundar didn't move. He just watched quietly, his face serene, his eyes reflecting both relief and sadness. The judge continued, Mr. Pichai, before I render the court's decision, do you wish to make a final statement? Sundar stood, buttoning his jacket slowly. The room grew still. Your Honor, he began, I didn't come here to win a case. I came here to remind us all what justice means. It's easy to lose faith when deceit wears a suit and walks with power, but I believe every act of honesty, no matter how small, keeps this world from collapsing. He paused, his gaze moving. Across the room, from the lawyers to the witnesses to the young interns watching from the back. This court saw laughter when I first stood here. People thought I didn't belong. But I've learned that belonging doesn't come from a title or a degree. It comes from truth, from refusing to stay quiet when silence protects lies. I don't seek punishment for those who failed me. I seek awakening. May they learn that what they tried to bury was never theirs to own. His voice was low but powerful, and by the time he sat down, even those who had doubted him felt the weight of his words. The judge cleared his throat. Mr. Pichai, this court acknowledges your courage and integrity. Global Data Systems will face legal penalties, restitution requirements, and criminal investigation for corruption and fraud. This case will serve as precedent for ethical reform in corporate conduct. The gavel struck. Justice had spoken. But for Sundar, victory didn't feel like triumph. It felt like peace. The kind that comes after a storm, when everything broken lies quiet and clean again. As he walked out of the courtroom, the crowd parted silently. No one dared to mock this man anymore. The same people who once laughed at him now watched with admiration, even reverence. Outside, the press surrounded him again, but his assistant whispered, Sir, maybe we should leave quietly. Sundar nodded. Quietly is good. Truth doesn't need a parade. He stepped into the rain, and for a moment he just stood there, letting the drops fall against his face. The sky seemed to wash away the dust of long days spent under scrutiny and doubt. In that moment he thought of his father again, of that small living room in India where a boy once dreamed of building something meaningful. He remembered the warmth of his mother's hands, the gentle pride in her eyes when he said he wanted to change the world, not with noise, but with purpose. As he walked toward his car, a young law student ran up holding a notebook. "Mr. Pichai," she said breathlessly, "your words today? They changed how I see this profession. I came here to learn law, but I think I learned something greater." Sundar smiled kindly. Then this fight was worth it. Later that night, he returned home and sat by the window, looking out over the quiet city. The same phone that once brought threats now buzzed with messages of gratitude from students, journalists, and strangers who found hope in his stand. Yet he ignored the praise. He wasn't proud of exposing corruption. He was proud of not losing himself in the process. He wrote a single sentence in his journal before closing it. "When they mock you for standing alone, remember, truth has always stood alone first." Then he turned off the light, finally allowing himself to rest. The case had ended, but the message had only begun. Somewhere out there, people who once stayed silent were finding their voices again. The echo of his stand would travel farther than he could ever imagine, through classrooms, offices, and hearts that had forgotten what courage sounded like. And as dawn broke again, painting the city gold, Sundar stepped onto his balcony, breathing in the cool air. The world was still imperfect, still noisy with greed and ego, but somewhere deep within it, one small flame burned a little brighter, the flame of truth, unchained. The legacy of silence months passed since the courtroom doors last closed behind Sundar Pichai. The world had moved on, or so it seemed, but echoes of his case still lingered in quiet conversations, in classrooms where professors quoted his words, and in boardrooms where new policies were being written to prevent another corporate deception. Yet Sundar, true to his nature, had stepped away from the noise. He didn't chase headlines, didn't attend interviews, didn't care for awards. He had always believed that real change didn't need applause. It needed consistency. One evening, he sat alone on the terrace of his home, watching the sunset spill over the city skyline. The air was gentle, filled with the hum of life returning to normal. But his mind was elsewhere, not in the comfort of victory, but in the quiet reflection of what it had cost. He had seen how power bends truth, how greed hides behind polished smiles, and how laughter in a courtroom can quickly turn into silence when truth stands tall. He had learned that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's walking through it with grace. A soft knock broke his thoughts. It was Lena Thompson, the young programmer who had testified in court. She smiled shyly as she stepped onto the terrace. "I'm sorry to disturb you, sir. I just wanted to say thank you. My life changed because you didn't give up. Companies now treat transparency differently. And I started my own small firm. We work only on open source projects." Sundar looked at her warmly. "You don't owe me thanks, Lena. You chose honesty when it was hardest. That's what real success is, not building something that makes you rich, but something that makes you sleep peacefully." She nodded, her eyes glistening. "People said you were crazy to fight alone. Now they call you brave." He smiled faintly. "Bravery is just what they call stubbornness when it finally works." They both laughed quietly, and for a moment, the tension of the past months faded into calm understanding. After she left, Sundar returned to his desk. The rain began to fall outside, soft, rhythmic, soothing. He opened his laptop and began to type a message. It wasn't for the media or the company. It was for young engineers, dreamers, and thinkers who followed him quietly, looking for guidance. He wrote, "Truth doesn't shine in headlines. It glows in decisions no one sees. The world will test your patience, your integrity, your silence. Don't rush to prove yourself. Just do what's right, even when no one claps. Because someday, that quiet decision will speak louder than every speech you'll ever give." He closed the laptop, feeling lighter. He didn't need to change the entire world. It was enough to remind a few people that honesty still mattered. The next morning, as sunlight spilled into his office, Sundar found a letter on his desk. Handwritten, elegant, with no sender's name. Inside it said, "I was one of the officials mentioned in the investigation. I was part of the silence that allowed the corruption to grow. I lost my job, but I regained my conscience. You reminded me that truth is not weakness. Thank you." He read the note twice, then folded it carefully. No anger, no satisfaction, just quiet understanding. That was the true impact of his journey. Not punishment, but transformation. Weeks later, he was invited to speak at a global ethics conference. The organizers expected a speech filled with legal triumphs, but Sundar spoke differently. Standing before the crowd, he said, "The day you defend truth, the world won't cheer. It will test you, it will mock you. But remember, truth has no defense lawyer, no budget, no lobbyists. It only has those who refuse to sell it." The audience fell silent. No one clapped at first, not because they disagreed, but because they were too moved to react. As he stepped off the stage, an old journalist approached him. "Mr. Pichai," she said softly, "years ago when that judge laughed at you, did you ever think it would end like this?" He smiled, eyes distant with memory. "No," he said, "I didn't think it would end. Truth doesn't end. It just changes hands." Later that night, back in his quiet home, Sundar brewed himself a cup of tea and sat by the window again. Outside, the city shimmered. Countless lives moving forward, unaware of how one courtroom moment had shifted an entire generation's sense of fairness. He thought of his father again, the man who once told him, "Never fear small beginnings, fear small hearts." He looked up at the stars and whispered, "You were right, Papa. It was never about winning. It was about staying kind when the world wasn't." In that stillness, something peaceful settled inside him. Not the thrill of justice, but the calm of knowing he had done what was necessary. He had walked through doubt, endured laughter, faced threats, and yet never lost the gentleness that made him who he was. The world would move on, new scandals would emerge, new cases would fill headlines. But somewhere, in the quiet corners of conscience, in programmers, judges, clerks, and students, a spark would remain. The spark of one man who refused to bend when everyone told him to. And as the last light faded from the sky, Sundar whispered his final truth, not for others, but for himself. Silence is not weakness when it protects what is right. Sometimes the loudest victory is peace. And in that moment, with the rain beginning to fall softly again, Sundar Pichai closed his eyes, not as a CEO, not as a public figure, but as a man who had defended the one thing the world forgets too easily: integrity.